Now, morals are those principles that we use concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. For young children, their moral code tends to be pretty simple. Things are either right or they're wrong. They're good or they're bad. It's all in black and white. But as children get older and they have more experiences, they'll learn that no situation is ever that simple. There is no such thing as completely bad or completely good. There's varying degrees of righteousness. There are shades of gray, so to speak. So when two people get into an argument, it's pretty much never the case that one of them is 100% right and the other person's 100% wrong. What you need to figure out in these moral dilemmas is who's more right, who's being more righteous in this particular case. And examples like that, cases where you have to figure out who's the most righteous, is exactly how a lot of the research on moral development has been done. So a researcher by the name of Kohlberg, Lawrence Kohlberg, analyzed children, adolescents, and adults. And he looked at how they would respond to a wide range of moral dilemmas. And he identified 3 levels of moral reasoning. It's like a hierarchical progression as people grow older. So during level 1, which you see mostly in children, moral reasoning is based largely on external forces, like reward and punishment. During level 2, moral reasoning is mostly based on social norms. So it's typically an adolescent, what the adolescent thinks their friends think about them, or what their friends might say. And then level 3, this is typically the adult level. This is when moral reasoning is based more so on personal beliefs. So reward and punishment and other people's opinions, that stuff doesn't really matter as much anymore. Now it's about just what you believe deep down. So here is one of the classic dilemmas from Kohlberg's research. In Europe, a woman was near death from cancer. There is a drug that might save her. It's a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered, and the druggist was charging $2,000 for it. That's 10 times what the drug cost him to make. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, borrowed money from everyone he knew to afford the treatment, but he could only raise half the cost. He told the druggist his wife was dying and asked him to sell it for cheaper or to let him pay later, but the druggist simply said, "No. If you don't have the money now, then you don't get the drug." So, angry and desperate, Heinz broke into the druggist's store later that night and stole the drug for his wife. So this kind of moral dilemma was presented to the participants, and they were basically just asked a few simple questions, such as, did Heinz do something wrong here? And then whether they said yes or no, they would often follow it up with, why do you feel that way? So depending on the age, depending on the stage in the moral development, you'd get some pretty different answers. So children typically would respond in ways that corresponded with this what's called the preconventional level of moral reasoning. This is the first level of reasoning where it's based largely on things like reward and punishment. And each one of these levels is actually broken down into a couple of stages. So level 1, stage 1, this is where children assume what we call an obedience orientation, where a moral reasoning is based on the belief that adults know what is right and what is wrong. So children will just do something and they'll believe something simply because mommy said so. Like, it sounds very overly simplistic, but for younger children, this is how they tend to operate. If mommy says it's good, then it's good. Now, level 1, stage 2, that's when children assume a more instrumental orientation. So at this point, it's not really about what mommy says, it's about how the child is punished. Moral reasoning is based on the aim of looking out for one's own needs. So it's all about that punishment and reward. And just over time, every child's different, but over time, this will slowly transition to level 2, the conventional level of moral reasoning. This is that second level where moral reasoning is based on social norms. Now, in level 2, stage 1, this is where children will focus on interpersonal norms. This is where they base their moral decisions on how to best win the approval of others, typically peers, but others in a broad sense. And then level 2, stage 2, this is where children start to develop a more social system morality, where now they've moved beyond just their small social circle and they're thinking about society as a whole. Like their moral reasoning is based on trying to maintain order in our society. And then just like how children will transition into this conventional level, teenagers will slowly transition into level 3, the post-conventional level. This is that third level where moral reasoning is based on some kind of personal moral code. So in level 3, stage 1, this is where adults, typically they're adults at this point, it could occur during childhood, but typically adults will develop something we call a social contract, where moral reasoning is based on the belief that laws are for the good of all members of society. And if those laws are not leading to good results, then the laws should be changed. But typically there is a adherence to most laws at this point. And then at level 3, stage 2, this is when these young adults will start to develop a universal ethical code. They'll have universal ethical principles, where their moral reasoning is based on principles that apply to all people across all situations. So they'll have typically very simple ideas that they try to adhere to, like the importance of the preservation of life over all else. Like it doesn't matter if a person steals or is assaulted or anything else. If these things are done in the effort to maintain life, to save a person's life, then it's perfectly fine to do these kinds of things. So they might respond to Heinz's dilemma by saying, while it is important that people don't steal, that's going to cause problems in our society, what's most important in this situation is saving a person's life. So that's one kind of response you might hear. But when it comes to younger individuals, they might say different kinds of things, like the pre-conventional, that level 1. These children will probably say stuff like Heinz shouldn't steal because it's illegal, or Heinz shouldn't steal because he could get arrested, he could get punished, or maybe he could get fined in some way. Like children clearly show signs of fear of, somehow being harmed. It's all about that reward and punishment, like I said. And then when it comes to teenagers, typically those are the ones that have reached level 2, that conventional level, they'll say things like Heinz should steal the drug because that's what other people would probably do. That's what his friends would probably do. And furthermore, his wife, is depending on him. His wife has expectations on him to try to help her, right? Like he has got this kind of social obligation to fulfill. So those are the kinds of things that a teenager might say. And then when it comes to the post-conventional, I already mentioned one example, but honestly, it's kind of hard to give a good, common example because these are so personal at this point. During the post-conventional level, it's all based on personal moral code, so you can get a huge range of responses. They can be based on all different kinds of things. Like for some individuals, they might believe in this strong adherence to the law, so even though a person's life might be lost, they value the rule of law above all other considerations. So I think it's most interesting to talk to people about these kinds of moral dilemmas once they've reached this third level. Now, this research that Kohlberg has done on moral reasoning has gotten a lot of support from other scientists. We've done many like longitudinal studies showing that people do seem to progress through these levels, through these different stages. They don't skip a stage. So you can actually chart a child's moral development into adulthood and see how they would respond to these moral dilemmas and how that can change. Another thing that we've found from the research is that these kinds of little moral dilemma arguments, you could call it like a little game or whatever, these kinds of things, they're not just abstract little exercises, they're actually linked to behavior. So moral reasoning and actual behavior are strongly associated. Younger individuals we've seen typically only act moral if they're rewarded for doing so. And they will not do things that we would consider morally good if they're punished for it. So, like I've already said, that it doesn't matter like what the consequences of their behavior are. If they're rewarded for it, they'll do it. It's very simple for them. But there are some interesting other things we see in the research. Like it's not simple. There's a lot of studies showing that moral reasoning is inconsistent across situations and between cultures. For example, cultures that espouse different moral principles do tend to resolve these moral dilemmas in different ways. Some cultures just do not stress the individual rights and justice that seem to be so central to a lot of Kohlberg's ideas. Like, for example, Hindus stress caring and duty for others and tend to favor moral solutions that benefit others. So what these findings show us is that Kohlberg he did have some really good ideas as to how moral reasoning develops, but it's not universal. These findings mostly seem to apply to Western philosophy and religious tradition. And other researchers have pointed out that these stages also seem to apply mostly towards Western men. So this is research done by Carol Gillen and many others, where they found that there do seem to be some gender differences in these moral problem solving and how they rationalize their actions. Like in general, men tend to have more of what you would call like a justice ethic, whereas Western women tend to stress the ethics of care, like their duty to help others. But as a whole, these studies on gender differences in moral reasoning have shown relatively small differences. Like females tend to focus more on the morality of the action that they would have to take, whereas males would focus more so on the results of that action. So there's this classic moral dilemma that has been used in many of these studies called the trolley problem. You may have heard of this before. So imagine that you're a worker at a switchboard and you see a couple people on the tracks and there's a trolley bearing down on them. Now, you have the ability to flip a switch to redirect the trolley onto a different track where it would only kill one person. So think about that just for a sec. You have the ability, you have the power to choose who lives and dies here. Do you let this trolley continue down the first track where it kills two people? Or do you flip that switch and send it down the other track where it only kills one person? So this might seem like a strange example, it might even seem like an obvious answer, but how you rationalize your answer says a lot about your moral reasoning. Like if you decide to send it down the other track where there's only one person, it would be interesting if you had a specific reason for that. A lot of people just kind of intuitively pick that one, but if you really press people on it, they'll probably say something like, more life is more valuable than less life. Two people are better than one person. But a good question when it comes to this particular dilemma is, should you have the power to decide that? Should you, as this trolley worker, be able to pick who lives and dies? So there's no right answer here. That's how these moral dilemmas typically work. But the interesting thing is how most people do seem to fall in line somewhat with Kohlberg's theory, despite all of these, differences across cultures and situations and such. Now, for the most part, when it comes to developing a child's moral skills, moral reasoning, you don't really need to do all that much. You don't need to teach people to be pro-social. You don't need to teach people to want to help others. That comes naturally, especially in humans. The human species has been as successful as it is because we're so, naturally inclined to help each other. We're very cooperative as a species. But what you do need to do is help children direct those instincts. Teach them the most effective ways to be helpful. One way to teach moral behavior is just by discussing these kinds of moral dilemmas with someone of a younger age and trying to talk to them about what their actions are and what the consequences could be and what you would do and what you think your consequences would be. So you just basically discuss these situations. And this can be especially helpful if one person is at a higher level. So if you're in this third level of Kohlberg's, hierarchy, and you're talking to somebody in level 2, then that can dramatically help them to reevaluate their perspectives, reevaluate what kinds of behaviors they might engage in and why. Now, just to wrap up this whole discussion about morality, it's a common myth that morality comes entirely from religion. I mean, sure, religion is a common way that people get the beginnings of their moral code, but it's not the same for everybody. Religion may be a popular way to do that, but if for people of various religions, for people who have no religions, they also have these natural instincts to be helpful, and they develop a moral code based on that. However, we do tend to see that people who are involved in organized religion tend to be more outgoing. They tend to show more concern for the well-being of others. But, and I don't think I really need to point this out, there is a lot of variability between the various religions in the world, and they can differ pretty greatly in their teaching as to how to best act morally. Like what might be righteous and moral behavior in one religion could be completely, terrible in another. There's a lot of conflicts that have arisen because of these differences in teachings. And just to name a few examples, issues like child marriage, use of contraceptives, polygamy, women's rights, war, drug use, honor killing, homosexuality. These are just a few of these moral topics that have been the subject of a lot of heated debate over the span of history.